Hi, everyone. My name is Meghan Banton, and I'm a physical anthropologist who specializes in bioarchaeology. Essentially, what that means is I have a very specialized skill set that allows me to identify human skeletal remains and to read those remains for important information, such as how old they were when they died, their sex, their height, what was their ancestry, is there any trauma that was present, or any diseases present in those remains. I work for the Utah SHPO as a forensic/physical anthropology assistant. And my job is involved in the process of helping the state fulfill requirements for laws that relate to the discovery and repatriation of archaeological human remains. The research I want to share with you today is related to remains that were excavated and analyzed as part of this type of work. And is titled The Early 20th Century Dissection Methods, a case study from the early years of the University of Utah School of Medicine. I will begin the talk today by telling you a little bit briefly about how the remains were discovered and how the antiquity section, now known as the SHPO, determined that these remains were associated with the University of Utah School of Medicine. And then I'll move into the research itself, telling you about how different marks in the skeleton compare with historical documentation about dissections from this period and the University of Utah School of Medicine specifically. But I'm actually going to take the video down. There we go. Before I actually get into that presentation, I do want to give a little bit of a disclaimer, which is there will be images of human remains in this presentation. If that's something that you're not comfortable with, you may want to skip this particular talk and come join us on another week for a different Facebook Live discussion. Like so many modern stories in archaeology, we began at a construction site where what was believed to be human remains were discovered. And indeed, that was the case, as you can see in the pictures on the slide. On the upper right-hand side, we have 3 human feet, and to the left, you'll see 2 bones vertically sticking out the ground. And then if you look to the left of those bones, you see kind of 2 sticking out the ground at an angle. And those are the tibia and fibula, which are the lower leg bones. This construction was being conducted in 2016 when they were building an addition to the George Thomas building on the University of Utah campus. And the George Thomas building is one of 8 historic buildings located on President's Circle, which is shown in the map here on the left, and the George Thomas building being circled in red. This construction was part of remodeling work that would ultimately create the Crocker Science Center, of which you can see the end result in the upper right-hand photo, with the new addition adjoining onto the older structure of the George Thomas building. So when they encountered what they believed to be human remains, essentially that eventually gets reported to the antiquity section, and Dr. Dorina Kopp went to the site and confirmed that they were indeed human remains and that there were multiple individuals present on the site. From there, the excavation process was carried out, and the remains were eventually taken to the Utah State History Human Remains Lab for further analysis. It was established pretty early on that these were indeed historic in nature and that they were associated with the University of Utah School of Medicine. And this was established in a few ways. First, artifacts associated with the remains included glassware that dated from 1900 to 1930. This glassware hinted at the medical school connection due to the nature of the glassware, which included things such as test tubes, pipettes, chemical jars, and medicine jars. Secondly, Dr. Kopp's on-site examination of the remains revealed some interesting evidence suggestive of the medical connection via a skull. And this skull consisted of a callet, also known as a skull cap, that had been removed in a manner consistent with a craniotomy, a procedure associated with human dissection. This is where the skull cap is sawn off to expose the brain for examination. You see 2 such examples here on the slide. On the left-hand screen, you have an example of a callet or a skull cap that's been removed. And then another individual is represented on the right-hand photo, where a skull base with the skull cap removed is shown. Historic research combined with the archaeological artifacts discovered with the remains led to the determination that the remains were most likely buried at the location, somewhere between the University of Utah School of Medicine's founding in 1905 and either initiation of construction in 1933 or completion of construction in 1935 of the George Thomas building. So the remains date very early on to the medical school's history. Now, there's a lot that we could potentially talk about with such an interesting assemblage, but today I'm primarily going to discuss three things with you. First, what are some of the examples of skeletal alterations observed that indicate dissection occurred, and what patterns can we establish from those alterations? Next, how do these alterations compare with historic documentation about early 20th century medical school practices? And finally, what does this assemblage tell us specifically about early practices of the School of Medicine at the University of Utah? I'm actually going to introduce point number 2 first, because the following slides, I will give you examples of alterations observed in the skeletal remains, and then explain those remains in relation to historical documentation. A little bit of background, human dissection, cadaver dissection has long been considered important to the teaching of human anatomy. For physicians and doctors. However, wider acceptance of that practice and obtaining bodies for this purpose struggled quite a bit on and off throughout history. However, by the time we get to the period we're talking about, which is the early 20th century, while that taboo had not disappeared, it had greatly lessened to the point that cadaver dissection was considered an essential part of a well-rounded medical school education in the United States and elsewhere in the world. So being essential to a medical school education, dissection manuals were often published in the early 1900s. And these texts are essentially a document that presents step-by-step instructions on how students should carry out a dissection, giving details on how things should be cut, with what instruments they should be cut, and in what order they should be done to best view anatomical structures. Obviously, such a text is perfect for understanding the types of alterations we would see in the George Thomas building assemblage. In this particular research, the manual I'm going to use as our representative example of historical documentation relating to dissections will be Holden's Anatomy, a manual for the dissection of the human body. This was published in 1901, so it is appropriate to the period we're discussing. And it is quite a hefty work. It is a 2-volume text that we found to align quite well with the skeletal alterations we observed in the George Thomas building assemblage. So for our first skeletal example, we're going to go back to craniotomies, of which there were 4 cases in the assemblage. The example on the slide shows the posterior or back portion of a skull base, which has the skull cap removed. Now, we know that the skull cap was removed from the base through the use of a saw due to a few reasons. First, the relatively smooth straight line that you see surrounding the upper region of the skull base fragment, pointed out by red arrows. And you also have an example here of a incomplete saw mark with the yellow arrow. Bone does not naturally break in nice straight lines like this, so we know a tool must have been used to achieve these marks. We know a saw is the most likely instrument based on fine serrations within the cut, which are characteristic of marks produced by a serrated bladed instrument, such as a saw. The other area of interest in this picture is now shown to you in the red brackets. While sawing surrounds the skull, the broken bone coming up from the saw margin in these red brackets indicates the last bit of the skull cap was likely removed through force, breaking of the bone or fracturing the bone, as opposed to cutting. And there are other examples on other portions of this specimen of similar breakaway points, but this is the largest. So what does Holden have to say? Well, he says to examine the brain and its membranes, the skull cap must be removed, about 1/2 inch above the supraorbital ridges in front and on a level with the occipital protuberance behind. It is better to saw only through the outer table of the skull and to break through the inner with a chisel. In this way, the dura and the brain are less likely to be injured. The location Holden is describing for removal of the skull cap is slightly higher in this example, but it is pretty accurate with what Holden is describing. Of more interest, he mentions that the inner table of the skull, which is the layer of the cranial bone closest to the brain, be broken through with the use of a chisel, as this protects the brain structures from being damaged. This is exactly what we see occurring in this example. The majority of the outer table, the layer of the cranial bone closest to the scalp, has been cut, but the last bit of removal has been achieved by breaking through the inner table, which is shown in the area of red brackets. From this documentation, we can infer that the breakage seen in this example was likely achieved with the use of a chisel. We're next going to talk about bones of the shoulder region, starting with the clavicle, or what most people refer to it as the collarbone. Of the 8 clavicles in the assemblage, 7 of them were sectioned near the midway point on the bone shaft, an example of which is shown here on the slide. Again, this was achieved through sawing, as was indicated by the striations I mentioned previously. In this close-up, you can see examples of these striations. Some have been shown to you with red arrows. In this assemblage, we also had 2 scapula, also known as the shoulder blade, showing evidence of the acromion process being sawn through, which is what you see on the slides. So what does Holden have to say about removal of shoulder type area? Well, in relation to the clavicle, he says, remove the arm by sawing through the middle of the clavicle. In this photo that you have on the slide, I am showing you 3 of the 7 sawn clavicles. In the diagram beside the photo, I have a typical anatomical drawing of a whole clavicle. The midpoint of the clavicle is drawn down the middle in black. Where the examples in the assemblage were typically cut is shown to you with a red line in the drawing. As you can see, the cuts in the assemblage are not perfectly located at midline, but this slight discrepancy could be explained in many ways. Perhaps an instructor gave slightly different instructions, or the manual that they used was not exactly Holden's manual. It may have been another manual that they were using that gave different instructions. No matter the case, it's still very close to midline and is on par with what we are expecting here from Holden's description. As for the scapula, Holden says to see its insertion, supraspinatus, the acromion should be sawn off near the neck of the scapula. In this photo on the right, I am showing you one of the examples in the assemblage of a sawn off acromion process. The red arrow is showing you the location of the cut where the process would normally be. In the diagram beside the photo, you have a typical anatomical drawing of the superior or top portion of the scapula. The acromion is the projecting knob on the left of the diagram, which comes off of the blade portion of the scapula via the spine. The spine is actually what you're viewing in the photo there on the right. Again, the red line on the anatomical drawing is showing you where this acromion process has been cut. As you can see, the cut occurs as it nears the neck of the scapula. So if you look at that line on the anatomical drawing, the red line, look directly underneath it, and you'll see that the closest landmark is indeed the neck. So this is describing removal of the acromion process exactly as Holden describes it in his text. From Holden, we can infer that such cuts may have been done in part to better observe shoulder musculature, such as he mentions in his quote, the supraspinatus insertion, which is located on the top of the humerus, which is the large upper arm bone. This area of the humerus is mostly hidden by the acromion of the scapula, so it makes sense to remove the acromion to observe this muscle insertion. This particular type of removal of the acromion would also allow further view of the thoracic inlet structures. The last specific skeletal example I'd like to show you is a complete spinal column that has the vertebral arch or the back portion of the vertebrae removed down the entirety of the spine. You only have partial of the spine shown in this particular photo. However, Holden does say, to examine in situ or in place, the spinal cord covered with its membranes, the arches of the vertebrae must be sawn through and removed. What Holden is describing is called a laminectomy, a procedure where the vertebral arch of one or more vertebrae is removed to give access to the spinal cord. This is done by cutting through the left and the right lamina. As you can see on the anatomical drawing, the lamina is immediately adjacent to the spinous process, which is the most posterior portion of the vertebral arch. The photo on the slide is a close-up of the mid-lower aspect of the altered spine, which displays these types of marks exactly. Complete sawing at the right and left lamina, as shown in the anatomical drawing, has resulted in the removal of the posterior aspect of the vertebral arches in the spinal column in the picture. The yellow arrow in this photo is showing the location where the spinous process and lamina would normally be if they had not been cut and removed. We also see incomplete saw marks, indicated by red arrows. These marks were getting too far away from the lamina, most likely, so the cutter stopped, realigned their tool, and began cutting again to get a better cut through the lamina. Moving away from the skeletal examples and onto patterns that we were able to establish by looking at the skeletal assemblage. In total, nearly 14% of the present bones and bone fragments exhibited cut marks and 15% exhibited saw marks. In the tables here, you can see the frequencies in which these marks occurred in each bone type. The processing of the remains appears quite selective in these tables, with some bone types being highly modified and others being affected far less. So for instance, the innominate bones, which are your hip bones, did not have many marks compared to other types of bones, such as the clavicles or the cranial or skull bones, which had quite a few marks. Within the bone types themselves, we also noticed that marks were quite consistent in where they occurred, which left some areas of bone highly marked and others barely affected. What does this type of data tell us? Well, it strongly suggests that the remains did not have all soft tissues removed prior to burial. Instead, only particular tissues were removed. So the cutting and sawing of the remains was targeted. They were cutting with purpose, which was to only remove bones and tissues that blocked other anatomical structures of importance from view. Another thing we noticed in the data was that the number of skeletal elements representing particular body regions varied greatly. For example, there were more identifiable lower limb bones, accounting for approximately 31% of the assemblage, than there were of upper limb bones, which accounted for about 11% of the assemblage. This type of pattern suggests that the remains were buried as bodily portions as opposed to whole cadavers, which is where the documentation of the University of Utah School of Medicine becomes interesting. Course catalogs from the early 1900s were examined for this research, and they indicate that the University of Utah School of Medicine taught 6 or 7 anatomy courses, with the majority being focused on dissection of particular body regions. These types of catalogs also, as you can see, I've represented one of these catalogs in the table here from 1906 to 1907. And as you can see from that table, the course section options included things such as upper extremity, lower extremity, thorax and abdomen, head, neck, and spine. Now, this alters slightly between catalogs. Sometimes they have more classes involved, but it always keeps this sort of regional focus on particular areas, and they are always taught at different portions of the year. So these sections being taught across different portions of the year, the autumn, spring, and winter. For example, in the 1918-1919 catalog, the arm and leg were taught in the autumn, the head and neck were taught in the winter, and the thorax was taught in the spring. So given this body region type focus spread out through the year, it would have been logical to use sections of remains deemed necessary for a specific course, rather than whole cadavers. In other words, why use a whole cadaver simply for the purpose of studying the arm? This suspicion that students likely dissected only portions of bodies in their courses appears to be confirmed by the burial context of the George Thomas building assemblage. As mentioned in the previous slides, evidence suggests the remains were buried as bodily portions rather than whole cadavers. Therefore, the findings of the skeletal analysis of the George Thomas building assemblage confirms the regional anatomy teaching methodology expressed in these early course catalogs from the University of Utah School of Medicine. So to summarize, what did we actually learn from this research? Well, I think there's kind of 3 important takeaway points. First, the medical students were not just simply cutting into bodies and examining and exploring. They were going about their dissections in a very methodical way, which indicates there was quality direction and instruction being given for their work. Most likely, these instructions came from both their professors and manuals such as Holden's Anatomy. And indeed, the course catalogs do mention that they used anatomical manuals to assist students with their dissections, though it does not mention specifically what manual that would have been. Secondly, we learned that the skeletal data matches documentational information from the early days of the University of Utah School of Medicine. In the early years of the medical school, they adopted a regional anatomy teaching methodology. This methodology was confirmed by the findings of the skeletal assemblage. To some, this may seem like a small thing, but quite frustratingly, alignment between documented sources in archaeology is not always a given. It does not always occur, which creates some issues in interpreting history. But since this is not the case for this assemblage, it adds strength and conviction to the interpretations we can make about the history of the University of Utah School of Medicine during this particular period. And in turn, it makes the George Thomas Building skeletal assemblage a reliable resource for future research into early 20th century medical school practices in the United States. And finally, something I haven't touched on yet, we learned that the techniques of dissection discovered in the documentation as well as the skeletal data are still employed today. The current manager of the University of Utah Body Donor Program told us the cuts on the bones are consistent with cuts we use today to gain access to deeper anatomical structures. The calvera is removed to gain access to the brain and cranial cavity. A laminectomy is performed to gain access to the spinal cord. Clavicles are cut to study the greater vessels, trachea, esophagus, and associated structures exiting and entering the thoracic inlet. So what I interpret from this, and what I think is kind of a cool point to end on, is that it appears the medical students roughly 100 years ago had a similar practical anatomical education to those of modern students at the University of Utah. So thank you for tuning into this talk today. I hope that you enjoyed it and learned a few new things from it. If you did find it interesting, please tune in for another Facebook Live talk that's titled Vital Records, the Demography of an Early 20th Century Medical School Anatomical Cadaver Collection by Dr. Kopp. This will be given on May 7th, and essentially this is going to have a different discussion of the same assemblage. So if you did find this interesting, look that up on May 7th. Again, thank you, and I hope everyone has a great day.